I never thought of him as a man at first. He was just my mother's husband. The man who sat at our dinner table with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his voice smooth and measured, never raised, never hurried. He wasn't my father. I had one of those, though. He existed only in distant phone calls and sporadic birthday cards, this man. Daniel was something else entirely. He was the one who made sure the bills were paid, the one who calmed my mother's erratic moods, the one whose presence was always steady. He was my stepfather, but not in the way fairy tales tell it. He didn't try to discipline me. He didn't try to be my friend. He existed in my world like an immovable force, silent, restrained watching, and I barely noticed him until one day I did. It started the summer I turned 23, the year my mother and Daniel's marriage began to crack like old paint on the walls of our penthouse. She had always been restless, always chasing something she could never quite name, another business venture, another lover, another life. This time she had thrown herself into a wellness retreat in Bali. Her latest attempt at reinvention. It was supposed to last a month, then it stretched to 2. She left me behind with Daniel. I had just graduated college and had nowhere else to go. My mother insisted I stay in the penthouse instead of moving out on my own. You'll be safer here, she said. I knew the truth. It was easier to control me that way, and so Daniel and I became reluctant housemates in a space too big for just 2 people, our interactions limited to polite nods in the kitchen, passing each other in the hallways. The occasional "how was your day" exchanged in the evenings, but then something shifted. I began to see him. It was little things at first. The way he loosened his tie when he came home, the way his shoulders tensed when he read something on his phone, the way his voice dipped into something lower when he was on business calls late at night. He was different from the men I knew, older, composed, utterly in control, while boys my age scrambled for attention. He never seemed to care if anyone noticed him. That, I realized, was what made it impossible to look away. And then there was the night of the storm. The night it happened, the city was drowning in rain. Sheets of water lashed against the windows. Thunder growled low in the distance, and lightning sliced through the sky in violent streaks. I had always loved storms, the chaos of them, the way they made the world feel alive, but that night something felt different. I was alone in my room, curled up in bed with a book, when the power flickered, then cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the penthouse. I sat up, listening to the silence that followed. A moment later I heard footsteps in the hallway. Daniel, a soft knock at my door. Are you all right? His voice was close, just on the other side. I hesitated before answering. Yeah, just startled. There was a pause, then come downstairs. There's a generator in the study. I shouldn't have gone. I could have stayed in my room, waited for the lights to return, but something pulled me toward him. Maybe it was the silence, the way the storm had stripped the world down to only the 2 of us. I found him in the study, crouched beside a sleek black generator, his sleeves rolled up, his forearms taut as he worked. The dim glow of a flashlight cast his face in sharp relief, the strong jawline, the furrowed brow, the faint shadow of stubble. He looked up as I entered, his eyes unreadable. Sit, he said, nodding to the couch. I obeyed, tucking my legs beneath me as I watched him. Minutes passed, the hum of the storm filling the silence between us. He was always so contained, so perfectly measured, but in that moment something about him felt different. Maybe it was the darkness, or the way the rain blurred the outside world, leaving us in our own private cocoon. You don't like storms, I said, Breaking the silence, he glanced at me amused. And you do. I love them. They make things feel unpredictable. He exhaled a quiet laugh. That's the part I don't like. It was such an honest admission, so unlike him that I found myself staring for the first time. I wondered what kind of man he had been before my mother, before the penthouse and the expensive suits, before he became the one who had to hold everything together. I used to, though, he added, when I was younger. Something in his voice made my pulse quicken. What changed? His gaze met mine, then steady, searching. You grow up, you realize some things shouldn't be left to chance. The air between us shifted. The storm raged on outside, but in here the quiet was thick, charged with something I didn't have a name for. My breath felt shallow. I was suddenly hyper-aware of every small movement. The way his fingers flexed against his knee, the way his throat moved. He swallowed. I should have looked away, but I didn't, neither did he. It wasn't a moment, it was a series of them, stretching between us, drawing us closer to something unspoken. And for the first time I saw the truth in his expression. He was aware of me too. I don't know how long we sat like that, the storm crashing around us, before he finally stood. The moment shattered, and I exhaled, realizing only then that I had been holding my breath. I'll get the power back on, he said, his voice steady again, controlled, like nothing had happened at all, but it had, and we both knew it. After the storm, something between us changed. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things. I told myself I was imagining the way his eyes lingered a second too long when I walked into a room. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, different from the clipped professional tone he used with everyone else. The way I started waiting for him in the evenings, listening for the sound of his key in the door, the slow, steady rhythm of his footsteps as he moved through the penthouse. I told myself it was nothing, I was imagining things, but then came the night on the balcony. It had been one of those humid summer evenings, the air thick and heavy, the city glowing beneath us in gold and neon. I had been restless all day, unable to focus on anything, my thoughts circling back to Daniel in ways that made me uneasy. So I stepped out onto the balcony, letting the warm breeze brush against my skin, closing my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, he was there, leaning against the railing, sleeves rolled up, a drink in his hand. Watching me. Couldn't sleep, he asked. I shook my head. Too hot, he nodded, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt expectant. I forget how young you are sometimes, he murmured. The words sent a strange shiver down my spine. I'm not that young, I said. My voice was quieter than I meant it to be. He exhaled, rubbing a hand along his jaw. You don't know what you're doing. A pulse of heat rushed through me. And what is it that I'm doing? He didn't answer, but I could feel it in the way he looked at me, the way his hand tightened around his glass. He felt it too. I stepped closer, resting my hands on the cool metal railing, close enough that I could smell his cologne, feel the warmth of him in the space between us. He didn't move away. This is dangerous, he said, finally, voice low. I tilted my head. Then why aren't you stopping it? His jaw tensed. That was the moment. I knew that if I touched him, he wouldn't push me away, that if I leaned in just a little closer, he would let me, but he didn't. Instead, he exhaled sharply and stepped back, shaking his head as if to clear it. Go inside, he said, voice tight. Before we do something we can't take back. I should have listened. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I let my gaze drag over him, his broad shoulders, his strong hands, the way his lips parted just slightly, like he was holding something back. I wanted to break him, but for now I let him win. I turned, walking past him without another word, brushing against him just slightly. As I did, I didn't look back, but I knew he was watching me. Something had shifted after that night on the balcony. Daniel started avoiding me, not in a way that was obvious to anyone else, but I felt it. He came home later than usual, spent more time in his office. The easy conversations we used to have turned clipped, restrained. But it wasn't distance, it was resistance, and I wanted to break it the night it finally happened. It wasn't planned, maybe that was why it felt inevitable. I had been in the penthouse pool, floating on my back, the cool water licking at my skin. It was late, past midnight, the city a glowing sprawl of light below the water made me feel weightless, my body stretched and bare beneath the surface, my mind drifting somewhere hazy, somewhere reckless. I didn't hear him at first, not until I pushed my wet hair back and opened my eyes, only to find him standing by the pool's edge watching me. Daniel, my breath caught. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. For a moment neither of us moved. The water lapped softly against my skin, droplets sliding down my shoulders, my chest. His gaze flickered there for the briefest second before he looked away, exhaling slowly. "You shouldn't be out here this late," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. I swam toward the edge, my arms bracing against the cool stone as I lifted myself slightly, water cascading down my body. "You always act like I need protecting." His jaw clenched. "You don't know what you need." I tilted my head. "And you do." Silence, thick and charged. He should have walked away. He should have left me there, dripping and breathless, heart pounding from the way he was looking at me, but he didn't. Instead, his fingers flexed at his sides, his whole body tense like a man at war with himself. I pushed myself up further, closer to him, so close I could see the faint pulse in his throat, the way his chest rose and fell too evenly, like he was controlling every breath. "If you want me to stop," I whispered. "Tell me." The last of his restraint snapped. I barely had time to react before his hand curled around my wrist, yanking me forward, not roughly, but with something desperate, something raw. My body was still slick from the pool, and when I stumbled, his other hand caught me hot and firm against my bare waist. My breath hitched. We were too close, now closer than we had ever been, my wet skin against his dry shirt, the scent of him, whiskey and something darker, something purely him, clouding my thoughts. His fingers flexed slightly on my waist, like he knew he should let go, but couldn't bring himself to. "You don't know what you're doing," he murmured, his voice lower now, thicker. I looked up at him, at the way his eyes had darkened, the way his grip on me trembled just slightly. I swallowed. "Yes, I do." A sharp inhale. His gaze flickered to my mouth. I swayed forward just enough that my lips barely grazed the corner of his jaw. Not quite a kiss, but not nothing either. His body went completely still, like I had set something dangerous loose inside him. "Let me go," I whispered. His grip tightened. He was still fighting it, still pretending he was the composed man I had always known, but I could feel his control slipping, unraveling with every second that passed. And then finally, he exhaled sharply and let me go. I stepped back, my pulse a wild, unsteady thing. I expected him to say something, to tell me this was wrong, that it could never happen again, but he didn't. Instead, he just stood there watching me, his breathing uneven, his fists clenched like he was keeping himself from reaching for me again. Daniel was still standing there, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, his hands curled into fists like he was trying to physically restrain himself. I could feel it, his hunger, his war, the battle between what he knew was right and what he wanted. What he wanted was me. I could see it in his darkened gaze, in the way his throat moved when he swallowed, in the way his eyes kept flickering to my lips. His hands had been on me moments ago, hot, possessive, unwilling to let go, and I wanted them back. I took a slow step forward. He didn't move. "Tell me to stop," I whispered. He said nothing. Another step. I was so close now. I could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint scent of whiskey, and something deeper, something purely him. His breath was uneven, lips slightly parted, eyes locked onto mine like I was pulling him under. I reached for his wrist. He tensed. I dragged my fingertips up his forearm, slow and deliberate, feeling the strength beneath his skin, the way his muscles flexed. Beneath my touch, he was letting me, wanting me still. He didn't move. He needed me to make this decision for him, so I did. I pressed myself against him, my bare skin meeting the crisp fabric of his shirt, still damp from the pool. I felt him inhale, sharply felt the rigidness of his body, his hesitation. Right before it shattered completely, his hands were on me before I could take another breath. Fierce, unrelenting one, curling around my waist, yanking me. Flush against him, the other, tilting my chin up, forcing my gaze to meet his. Breathing was ragged, his pulse Thursdaying against mine. "This is wrong," he rasped. I barely had time to whisper, "I don't care," before his mouth crashed onto mine. The world tilted. His lips were hot, desperate, nothing like I expected, and everything I'd imagined there was. No hesitation, no slow build. He had been holding back for too long, and now that he had me, he wasn't letting go. I gasped against his mouth, and that sound, that tiny broken sound, seemed to undo him completely. His grip on my waist tightened, pulling me even closer, his fingers digging into my bare skin like he needed to memorize the shape of me, the feel of me. I was drowning in him, the heat of his mouth, the scent of him, the way his body pressed against mine, firm and solid and completely unforgiving. His hands roamed, fingers dragging over my back, my waist, learning me, claiming me. He tasted like whiskey and restrained, snapped in two, like a man who had spent too long denying himself something he desperately craved. I let my fingers tangle in his hair, let my nails scrape against the back of his neck. He groaned into my mouth, the sound so deep and wrecked that it made my knees go weak. His grip tightened, holding me up, anchoring me to him like he couldn't stand the idea of letting go. And neither could I. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but nothing could have prepared me for the way he kissed me, the way he touched me, the way he devoured me, like he had been starving for me all along, like he had been waiting for this. For me, and I knew then there was no turning back. The moment his lips met mine, everything else disappeared. The city outside, the weight of consequences, the voice in my head, whispering that this was wrong, because nothing about this felt wrong. Daniel was everywhere, his hands strong and commanding, pressing into my skin like he was memorizing the shape of me, his breath uneven and warm, fanning across my cheek, his body solid and unyielding, pulling me closer, 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 until there was nothing left between us. His mouth moved against mine with a hunger I had never felt before, a quiet desperation that sent a pulse of heat through me, making my pulse race. It wasn't soft or hesitant, it was raw, reckless, the kiss of a man who had tried to hold himself back for too long and was finally letting himself fall. A sharp gasp escaped my lips as his fingers tightened at my waist. lifting me, grounding me, consuming me. He groaned at the sound, his grip growing firmer, his body pressing harder into mine as if he needed all of me. My hands moved of their own accord, sliding over the broad planes of his shoulders, fingers twisting into the fabric of his shirt. He was warm beneath my touch, too warm, his muscles tensed as if he was still fighting himself, still trying to hold back, but I didn't want him to hold back. I tilted my head, deepening the kiss, pushing against him, breaking him apart the way he had broken me. He responded instantly, his hands slid up my spine, fingers spling across my bare skin, and a shudder ran through me. My breath hitched, my body arching into his instinctively, and something in him snapped 1 second. We were standing the next. My back was pressed against the cool glass window of the penthouse, the city lights flickering behind me as his hands framed my face, holding me there, holding me still as he kissed me like he was losing himself in me. His mouth left mine only to trail lower, his lips brushing over my jaw, the curve of my throat, the barest graze of his teeth against my pulse point. I gasped, gripping his arms, my head falling back against the glass. Daniel, his name escaped before I could stop it, breathless and full of something I couldn't even name. He froze, his forehead rested against my shoulder, his breathing ragged. The moment stretched between us, thick with heat, with unspoken words, with something deeper than either of us was ready to admit. Then slowly, painfully, he pulled back. His eyes were dark, his expression unreadable, but I could see the war still raging inside him, the battle between what we had just done and what it meant. This can't happen, he whispered, but his fingers were still on me. His body still pressed against mine, his breath still mingling with mine. Like fire, I reached up, cupping his face, forcing him to look at me. His control was slipping, his mask cracking. It already has, I whispered. I should have felt shame, guilt, fear, something, but all I felt was him. His breath was heavy, his hands still gripping my waist like he was caught between pushing me away and pulling me closer. He wanted me. I could feel it in the way his fingers trembled slightly against my skin, in the way his chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, in the way his gaze traced over my lips as if he was already imagining tasting me again. I lifted my hands, letting my fingertips ghost over his jaw, rough stubble, strong lines, heat. He shuddered beneath my touch. He wanted to stop. I could see it in his clenched jaw, the restraint carved into every rigid muscle of his body. But I also saw something else, the way his resolve was unraveling. So I whispered the one truth neither of us could escape. You don't want to stop. His grip on me tightened, not hard, not forceful, but desperate. I can't, he rasped. You know that. I leaned in, brushing my lips just barely over his. Not quite a kiss, but a promise of one. He inhaled sharply, his entire body tensing, his fingers digging into my skin as if I was pulling him under. Then don't, a curse, a sharp exhale, and then he broke. His hands slid up my sides, dragging heat in their wake. His mouth finally claiming mine again. This time it wasn't hesitant, it wasn't slow or careful or restrained. It was fire. Heat surged between us, a hunger that had been simmering too long, finally spilling over. His lips moved against mine, deep and unrelenting, as if he was trying to imprint himself on me. His fingers tangled in my hair, tugging, tilting, taking. I gasped against him, and he groaned in response, swallowing the sound like it was something he had been waiting to hear. My hands slid down his chest, feeling the ridges of muscle beneath his shirt, warmth and strength. And Daniel, his lips left my mouth, trailing across my jaw down my throat, pressing open-mouthed kisses against my skin. My head felt back against the cool glass, his breath hot against my collarbone, the sharp contrast making me shiver. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against my skin, but I didn't. Instead, I reached for the buttons of his shirt, slowly, deliberately, my fingers grazing the heat of his skin beneath. He inhaled sharply, his hands gripping my hips, holding me still as if grounding himself. My voice was barely a whisper. "I don't want you to," he cursed under his breath, his forehead pressing against mine, his control hanging by a frying thread. His fingers slid up my arms, tracing my bare skin with aching slowness. "You don't know what you're doing to me," he whispered. I smiled, small, knowing. "Wicked." "Yes, I do." A rough sound left him somewhere between a growl and a groan before his mouth crashed back onto mine. This time there was no hesitation, no second guessing. There was only us. There was no stopping now.